The old man won the lottery but didn't tell anyone. Years later, his children found out.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
I can't live like this anymore, Dad. Lucas growled, slamming his cup down on the old wooden table. The tea splashed over the rim and onto the table, startling Mr. Frank, who looked up abruptly from his rocking chair by the window. What is it this time? Mr. Frank sighed, his bony hands tightening around his pipe. His tired eyes reflected his exhaustion, as though his son's complaints had become a routine occurrence in recent days. Lucas stood up, his eyes blazing with frustration. Why do you insist on living in poverty, Dad? I can't take this anymore. My friends, they all have nice houses, cars, while I'm struggling to pay off every cent of debt. Mr. Frank looked at Lucas calmly, his gaze gentle yet firm. Lucas, we have enough to eat, enough to wear. I don't need more than that. You must live with integrity, not constantly measure yourself against what's in someone else's pocket. Lucas clenched his fists, his resentment surging. He couldn't understand his father. This small village, with its dirt roads and vast olive fields, was where Mr. Frank had spent his entire life. But for Lucas, it was nothing more than a cage, a place that stifled all his ambitions. In the small house tucked away behind the olive grove, Sophia, Mr. Frank's granddaughter, was diligently working on her homework. The young girl's eyes sparkled with intelligence, a stark contrast to her father's perpetual frustration. Did Dad fight with Grandpa again? Sophia asked when she saw Lucas storming in with a scowl on his face. You wouldn't understand, Sophia. Your grandpa is too stubborn. Lucas replied irritably, slumping into a chair and running his hands through his hair. Sophia silently watched her father, her eyes tinged with sadness. At only 17, she could already sense the tension in her family. Her grandfather, with his calm demeanor and simple principles, was someone she deeply respected. But her father, Lucas, seemed to be drifting further away, consumed by ambition and materialism. I think Grandpa just wants to protect the family, Dad, Sophia said softly, trying to ease the situation. He doesn't want any of us to suffer. Lucas let out a bitter laugh, unable to hide his sarcasm. Protect us. Your grandpa just wants to keep us stuck in this poverty. Never mind, just focus on your homework. Stay out of grown-up matters. Sophia fell silent, but her mind was full of questions. She knew her father harbored many grievances, but the growing resentment in him worried her deeply. That night, Mr. Frank sat beneath the old olive tree beside the house. The tree had been there since his father's time, bearing witness to countless seasons, storms, and the ups and downs of the family. He bent down, his fingers lightly brushing the soft soil around the tree's base. Buried deep beneath the earth was an old wooden box, where he kept the lottery ticket he had won many years ago. It was a substantial amount of money, enough to change the family's life. But for Mr. Frank, money was never the priority. Family happiness and the peace of life were the true treasures. Do you think I did the right thing, old olive tree? Mr. Frank chuckled softly, talking to himself. If the kids knew, what would they think? Would they still love each other, or would they just fight over it? The sound of footsteps behind him startled him. Turning around, he saw Anna, his neighbor, approaching with a shawl draped over her shoulders. Good evening, Mr. Frank. I saw your lights were still on, so I thought I'd stop by, Anna said warmly. She was a woman in her 50s, always carrying an air of kindness. Anna often helped Mr. Frank with little chores around the house, especially when Sophia was busy studying. Oh, Anna. I was just sitting here alone, he replied, trying to mask the worry in his eyes. Did Lucas argue with you again? Anna asked, her concern evident. He seems to be getting more and more upset lately. Mr. Frank sighed and nodded. The boy sees life differently, Anna. He wants more than I can give. Anna remained quiet for a moment, then gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Mr. Frank, I know you just want to keep the family together. But sometimes, keeping secrets only makes things more complicated. Mr. Frank lowered his head, saying nothing. Deep down, he knew Anna's words were true. But he still couldn't bring himself to share the truth. Not far away, Lucas stood in the shadows, suspicion gleaming in his eyes. He had overheard bits of the conversation between his father and Anna, though not enough to fully understand. Still, he was certain his father was hiding something. What could that old man possibly be hiding? Lucas muttered. He was determined to find out. Lucas entered the house, his eyes burning with determination. He rummaged through the kitchen, where his father often kept important documents. But all he found were old bills, nothing unusual. What on earth is he hiding? Lucas growled through clenched teeth, his anger rising. The morning sunlight filtered through the olive branches, illuminating the small family home in California. Mornings in the countryside were always serene, but within Lucas, a storm was brewing. "Is Grandpa up yet, Sophia?" Lucas asked as he saw his daughter preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Sophia looked up, her clear eyes showing a hint of hesitation at her father's sharp tone. "Grandpa's out watering the trees, Dad." Lucas said nothing more. He stepped outside, his eyes fixed on the small figure of his father. Mr. Frank was bent over, carefully watering each olive tree. Lucas's suspicion continued to grow. Later that afternoon, Lucas searched through an old trunk in the corner of the house, where his father often stored keepsakes from long ago. Sophia stood nearby, her curious eyes watching her father. "Dad, what are you looking for?" Sophia asked. "Nothing, go do something else," Lucas replied curtly, trying to hide his tension. Sophia didn't want to upset her father, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from his strange behavior. The trunk was full of old photos, aged papers, and a few trinkets. Lucas opened every compartment, flipped through every piece of paper, but found nothing of interest. "This can't be, there has to be something." Lucas muttered, as if talking to himself. "Do you think Grandpa is hiding something?" Sophia suddenly asked, making Lucas look up at her. "Don't meddle in adult matters," Lucas said, his voice sharper than usual. Sophia remained silent and turned away, but inside, her curiosity grew stronger. Why was her father acting this way? He constantly criticized Grandpa, yet Sophia sensed a deep bond between the two, despite their frequent arguments. That night, Lucas tossed and turned on his old bed. The wind rustling through the olive trees seemed to urge him to act. Images from the past flooded his mind, days of hardship, moments when his friends mocked him for his family's poverty. That poverty had etched itself into his memory like a scar that refused to heal. "I can't let my life stay this way," Lucas thought. He didn't believe for a second that his father truly had nothing. His instincts told him that Mr. Frank was hiding a big secret. Near midnight, Lucas quietly slipped out of his room. The house was pitch dark, with only moonlight streaming through the windows. He grabbed a flashlight and silently headed to the yard. The old olive tree, where his father often sat in the evenings, loomed in the shadows. Lucas approached it, his eyes filled with determination. Kneeling down, he began digging at the base of the tree with his hands. The damp soil clung to his fingers, cold and clammy. The deeper he dug, the more his anticipation grew. After a while, his hand struck something hard. Lucas's heart raced. He pulled up a small wooden box, covered in dust and moss. This was what his father had been hiding all along. At last, Lucas muttered, a triumphant smile creeping across his face. He opened the box to find an old lottery ticket, its edges faded with time, along with a few documents. His eyes landed on a bank statement, the numbers on it so large they made him dizzy. "Dad! Dad has this much money and never told me?" Lucas whispered, anger and greed welling up inside him. To him, this wasn't just a betrayal but a chance to change his life forever. The next morning, Mr. Frank noticed that the soil beneath the olive tree had been disturbed. His heart sank. It seemed that what he had feared most had come true. Lucas was waiting for him inside the house, his face cold and his eyes filled with defiance. "How much longer were you planning to keep this a secret?" Lucas began, his tone icy. "I found the box under the tree. The lottery ticket, the money, everything." Mr. Frank sat down in his chair, his hands trembling. He didn't look Lucas in the eye, instead bowing his head as though trying to suppress an invisible pain. "Lucas, you don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "I did this to protect our family. Money doesn't bring happiness, son." "Happiness? You think living in poverty is happiness?" Lucas shouted, his anger boiling over. "You've ruined my life because of your selfishness. I can never forgive you." "Lucas," Mr. Frank began, but his son's eyes were filled with resentment, leaving no room for explanation. Lucas stood up and stormed out, leaving Mr. Frank sitting motionless in anguish. His concern wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about how his son had changed from a kind-hearted boy into a man consumed by materialism. That evening, Sophia sat beside Mr. Frank, her eyes full of worry. "Grandpa, what did Dad say to you?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with concern. Mr. Frank only shook his head, offering no reply. But the sadness in his eyes said it all. Sophia could tell that this wouldn't end easily. Lucas couldn't sleep that night. The enormous figures on the bank statement kept flashing in his mind. The money was enough to pay off his debts, buy a new house, and start over. But what about Mr. Frank? To Lucas, his father was just a stubborn old man, endlessly preaching hollow virtues. Lucas felt he couldn't wait any longer. That money belonged to him, and he would do whatever it took to get it. The following morning, Lucas met with Lawrence, a lawyer he had known for years. Lawrence was pragmatic and ambitious, always willing to help his clients achieve their goals for the right price. "What do you need my help with, Lucas?" Lawrence asked, holding a cigar as his sharp eyes peered through gold-rimmed glasses. Lucas sat down, his expression determined. "My father has a large sum of money. I need to get it, but he refuses to hand it over. I need a legal way to take control of his assets." Lawrence smirked, leaning forward slightly. "Whose name is the asset under?" "Of course, it's under his name. But he's old, and his memory is starting to fail. I could argue that he's no longer capable of managing his finances," Lucas replied, his tone laced with bitterness. That's a plausible argument," Lawrence nodded, his face thoughtful. "But if your father contests it, we'll need solid evidence. Has he displayed any unusual behavior recently?" Lucas thought for a moment, then nodded. "He often talks to himself under the olive tree. Everyone in the village has seen him do it. They're bound to think he's not in his right mind." "Perfect," Lawrence replied, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "We'll file a petition for the court to appoint you as his legal guardian. Once that's approved, you'll have full control of his assets." Lucas nodded, his eyes gleaming with greed. "Leave everything to you, huh? Just get me that money." That afternoon, Mr. Frank sat quietly beside Sophia, mending an old shirt. Sophia watched him, her heart heavy. After the conversation the night before, she could feel that some secret was driving a wedge through their family. "Grandpa, is Dad pressuring you about something?" Sophia asked gently. Mr. Frank looked up, his kind eyes reflecting exhaustion. "Sophia, don't worry. This is between me and your father. But I can't stand by and watch you suffer like this," Sophia said, her voice growing more resolute. "If Dad is doing something wrong, you have to tell me." Mr. Frank gently shook his head and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sophia, I don't want you involved in this. You're still young, and you should focus on your studies." Sophia fell silent, but her heart remained troubled. She knew her father was changing, and those changes were not for the better. That night, Lucas returned home with a stack of documents in his hand. Lawrence had prepared everything quickly. Lucas felt like everything was going according to plan. "Dad, we need to talk," Lucas said when he found Mr. Frank sitting on the porch, staring out at the olive grove. "What is it now, Lucas?" Mr. Frank sighed, his eyes still fixed on the sunset. Lucas approached, placing the stack of documents on the table. "I want you to sign this. It's to transfer the management of your assets to me. I'll take care of everything." Mr. Frank picked up the documents, his hands trembling as he read through them. His face slowly shifted to one of shock and pain. "Lucas. What are you doing? This is my property, and it's my right to decide what happens to it. You're no longer capable of handling all of this." Lucas snapped, his voice filled with accusation. "You sit on that money without using it while Sophia and I struggle every day. Do you ever think about us?" "Lucas, you don't understand," Mr. Frank said, his voice hoarse. "Money only brings trouble. I kept that money because I didn't want it to tear this family apart." "Family? Do you think this family is still intact?" Lucas shouted, his face flushed with anger. "You care more about your outdated principles than your own son. Lucas. You've let greed blind you," Mr. Frank said, his voice breaking with sorrow. "You're not the same kind boy I once knew." Lucas clenched his fists, trying to contain his rage. He knew arguing with his father any further was pointless. But in his mind, the plan was already clear. If Mr. Frank refused to sign, Lucas would find another way to force him. In the shadows, Sophia stood frozen, listening to the entire conversation. She couldn't believe her father was trying to take away her grandfather's property. Her heart ached as she saw the pain in Mr. Frank's eyes. Sophia returned to her room, her mind in turmoil. She loved her father, but she couldn't let her grandfather be treated unfairly. Sophia knew she had to do something. She would protect Mr. Frank, no matter what it took. Sophia stayed up all night, unable to sleep. She replayed everything her father had said to Lawrence in his phone calls. Words like court, guardianship, and asset management kept echoing in her mind. She realized her father wasn't just trying to pressure her grandfather into signing, he was planning something far bigger to take control of everything. "I can't stand by and watch this," Sophia whispered to herself, determination lighting up her eyes. The next morning, Sophia woke up earlier than usual. She looked for a way to talk to Mr. Frank while her father was still asleep. Sophia knew time was running out, and if she didn't act soon, things could spiral out of control. "Grandpa, I need to ask you something," Sophia said as she found him fixing the garden fence. "What is it, sweetheart?" Mr. Frank looked up, a warm smile flickering in his tired eyes. "Are you having trouble with Dad?" Sophia asked directly, her voice filled with worry. Mr. Frank sighed and set down the hammer. "Sophia, this is an adult matter. I don't want you caught up in it." "But Grandpa," Sophia said firmly, her eyes shining with resolve. "I heard Dad talking about getting you to sign over your property. I don't know what's happening, but don't let him pressure you into something you don't want to do." Mr. Frank silently looked at Sophia, seeing the maturity and kindness in his granddaughter. He knew he couldn't keep hiding the truth forever. "Sophia, your father is blinded by greed. I only hope that you don't follow down that same path." Sophia nodded quietly, but her heart was heavy with conflict. She knew she had to do more than just offer words of support. Meanwhile, Lucas met with Lawrence again to discuss the next steps of their plan. "You need to act quickly, Lucas," Lawrence said firmly. "If your old man doesn't sign, we can file a legal petition to have him placed in a nursing home. The court will approve it if we can provide evidence that he's no longer mentally competent." Lucas frowned, a hint of hesitation crossing his face. "You're saying I need to push my father out of his own home?" "You don't have another choice," Lawrence shrugged. If you want control over the assets, this is the only way. Lucas sat silently for a moment, but inside, his greed won the battle. Fine. Do whatever it takes to make it happen. Lawrence nodded, a satisfied glint in his eyes. He knew Lucas was falling deeper into the trap he had set. That evening, Sophia accidentally overheard one of Lucas's phone calls. Standing behind the door of her father's study, she froze as she heard words like nursing home, legal documents, and control of assets. Just as I thought, Sophia whispered, anger and disappointment washing over her. She couldn't believe her father would go this far. Sophia knew she had to act to protect her grandfather. She thought of her friend Carmen, a bright law student at her university. Without hesitation, Sophia texted Carmen, briefly explaining the situation and asking for her help. "We need to gather evidence," Carmen texted back. "If your dad is really forcing your grandpa to sign the papers, we can intervene legally." Sophia felt slightly relieved. At least, she wasn't alone. The next day, Lucas approached Mr. Frank again, but this time with a completely different attitude. He tried to appear gentle and persuasive. "Dad, I don't want to pressure you," Lucas said, placing a hand on Mr. Frank's shoulder. "But you need to think about our family's future. If you transfer control of your assets to me, I promise to handle everything." Mr. Frank looked at his son, his heart breaking into silence. He could sense the insincerity in Lucas's words, but he also saw how much money had completely changed his son. "Lucas, do you really think money is everything?" Mr. Frank asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I kept that money to protect the family, not to tear us apart." "Family?" Lucas let out a mocking laugh. "You call this a family? A family that's always poor, always struggling, while I'm drowning in debt just trying to live like a normal person? You don't understand anything." Mr. Frank shook his head, his tired eyes heavy with sorrow. "Money will never bring true happiness, Lucas. I only hope you realize that before it's too late." "Too late?" "No, Dad. I think it's you who doesn't understand," Lucas replied coldly. "If you don't sign, I'll be forced to take this to court. And when that happens, everything will be out of your hands." Mr. Frank froze, unable to respond. He couldn't believe his son was capable of using such harsh words to threaten him. Meanwhile, Sophia began her own plan. She secretly monitored her father and Lawrence, trying to record their conversations. She also encouraged Mr. Frank not to sign any papers. "Grandpa, you have to promise me," Sophia said, her eyes filled with concern. "No matter what Dad says, don't sign anything. I'll figure out a way to help you." Mr. Frank nodded faintly, his trembling hands clasping hers. "Thank you, Sophia. I only hope you'll always keep this kind heart." Sophia looked at her grandfather, a surge of determination rising in her chest. She knew she had to be strong to protect him, even if it meant standing up to her own father. That night, Lucas brought home another stack of documents. He placed them on the table, ready to pressure Mr. Frank into signing. But this time, Sophia was prepared. She quietly recorded Lucas's actions with her phone hidden in her pocket. Lucas placed a pen in front of Mr. Frank, his tone filled with menace. "Dad, if you don't sign, I'll have to take this to court. You don't want to be forced into a nursing home, do you?" Mr. Frank stayed silent, his eyes cast down at the documents, a feeling of helplessness washing over him. Sophia stood in the shadows, gripping her phone tightly, thinking to herself, "Dad, I won't let this happen." The next morning, Lucas continued to apply pressure. He no longer tried to act gentle and instead took on a more forceful approach. His eyes glinted with cold determination, as though there was no trace of love left for his father. "Dad, I don't want to resort to drastic measures. But if you keep being stubborn, I won't have any other choice," Lucas said, tapping lightly on the stack of documents. Mr. Frank sat still, his gaze drifting out the window to the olive trees swaying in the breeze. "Lucas, do you think I'm afraid?" Do whatever you want. But as I've said, money will never be the thing that brings happiness. Enough. Lucas slammed his hand on the table, making Sophia jump in the kitchen. All you ever talk about is happiness, family, and all these meaningless things. Don't you see that we've suffered enough? Sophia stood frozen at the kitchen door, clutching a dish towel tightly. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Stepping into the room, she spoke up, "Dad, why are you saying this? Grandpa only wants to protect our family." Lucas spun around, his eyes blazing with anger. "Sophia, you don't understand this. Stay out of it." "But I do understand," Sophia said loudly, her eyes sparkling with determination. "I understand that money isn't worth losing our family over. Have you forgotten everything Grandpa has done for us?" Lucas let out a bitter laugh and turned to look at his father. "See that? Even my daughter has been brainwashed by you. Fine, if the two of you want to stand against me, I'll show you the consequences." With that, Lucas grabbed the stack of documents and left the house. His heavy footsteps echoed on the tile floor, leaving behind an oppressive tension. That evening, Sophia sat in her room, her heart filled with worry. She knew her father wouldn't stop. With his greed and stubbornness, he would do anything to get that money. But Sophia wasn't one to give up easily. She knew she had to act quickly before things spiraled out of control. She texted Carmen, her best friend, explaining in greater detail what had happened. Carmen responded immediately. "We need clear evidence of your dad forcing your grandpa to sign the papers. If you can, record their conversations or anything related." Sophia looked at her phone, her determination growing stronger. She knew Carmen was right. Evidence was the only key to saving her grandfather. Meanwhile, Lucas met with Lawrence at his law office. Lawrence's face exuded confidence, as though everything was already under control. "We've submitted the petition to the court," Lawrence said, sliding a document across the desk toward Lucas. "If your father refuses to sign, we'll use the court's decision to place him in a nursing home. Once that happens, the assets will legally fall under your control." Lucas nodded, but deep down, he felt a twinge of anxiety. He knew that Mr. Frank was a stubborn man who wouldn't give in easily. However, Lucas also knew he couldn't turn back now. That money was his only way out of a life filled with failure. Sophia decided she had to confront her father directly. She waited for Lucas to come home, his face full of smug satisfaction. "Dad," Sophia said, blocking his path at the door. "I know everything. You're planning to put Grandpa in a nursing home to take control of his assets, aren't you?" Lucas was startled but quickly regained his composure. "Sophia, you don't understand. Everything I'm doing is for the good of our family." "For the good of the family?" Sophia scoffed, her eyes shining with disappointment. "You call betraying Grandpa and forcing him into a nursing home good?" Lucas grew irritated. "Sophia, you have no idea how much your grandfather has been hiding. He has money, lots of money, yet he's let us live in poverty. I'm just taking back what's rightfully ours." "What's rightfully ours?" Sophia snapped, stepping closer to her father. "Have you forgotten that Grandpa worked hard his whole life to raise you? That money isn't yours to take unless he agrees." Lucas was stunned by his daughter's bold words. But he quickly brushed them aside. "You don't know anything. This is an adult matter, Sophia. Stay out of it." "I know more than you think, Dad," Sophia replied, her voice firm with determination. "If you don't stop, I'll do whatever it takes to protect Grandpa." Lucas stared at Sophia, a mix of anger and confusion in his eyes. He couldn't believe his daughter was standing up to him. But he also knew Sophia wouldn't back down easily. "Fine," Lucas said, turning and walking into his room. "Go ahead and try." That night, Sophia snuck into Mr. Frank's room with her phone. She told him everything, how Lucas had filed a court petition and was planning to put him in a nursing home. Grandpa, we can't let Dad do this. I've spoken to Carmen, and she says we need evidence to fight back. Mr. Frank sighed deeply, his eyes reflecting a profound sadness. Sophia, I don't want our family to fall apart. But I can't let Lucas do something so wrong. I'll help you, Grandpa, Sophia said, her voice filled with resolve. I'll protect you, even if I have to stand up to Dad. Mr. Frank looked at Sophia, his heart swelling with pride and emotion. Thank you, Sophia. You're my only hope right now. The next morning, Lucas received a call from Lawrence. Lucas, I've got good news. The court has agreed to review your petition. We just need to apply a little more pressure to get Mr. Frank to sign. If he continues to resist, we'll proceed with the next steps to take control of the assets, Lawrence said confidently. Lucas nodded, his eyes gleaming with greed. Got it. I'll handle it. He hung up the phone, a sense of urgency coursing through him. Lucas knew that if he acted quickly, everything would be within his grasp. But he had no idea that Sophia had been quietly gathering evidence against him. That evening, Lucas approached Mr. Frank again, this time bringing Lawrence with him. The two men stood before Mr. Frank with stern expressions, as if determined to corner him. Dad, Lucas began, his voice firm. This is the last time I'll ask you to sign the papers to transfer control of your assets. If you don't agree, we'll have to take legal action. Mr. Frank looked up at Lucas and Lawrence, his face filled with disappointment. Lucas, don't you feel ashamed treating your father like this? I can't understand how you could do something like this. You can think whatever you want, Lucas replied coldly. I just want to make sure the family's assets are used properly. Lawrence interjected, his gaze icy. Mr. Frank, if you refuse to sign, we'll file a petition to have the court declare you unfit to manage your finances. Once that happens, everything will belong to Lucas, whether you like it or not. Lawrence's words felt like a dagger to Mr. Frank's heart. His frail hands tightened into fists as a wave of helplessness washed over him. But before he could say anything, Sophia stepped into the room, holding her phone. Stop right there. Sophia shouted, her eyes blazing with anger. I know what you and Mr. Lawrence are doing. I've recorded everything you've said and done. Lucas spun around, his face pale. Sophia, what are you doing? I'm protecting Grandpa, Sophia replied firmly. I've heard everything. I know you're trying to force Grandpa into a nursing home to take his money. I've collected enough evidence to report you to the police. Lawrence let out a dry laugh, trying to maintain his composure. Young lady, do you really think you can do anything about this? This is a legal matter. A recording means nothing. Sophia raised her phone, her eyes resolute. Oh, really? Then tell me, Mr. Lawrence, do you think the police won't care about you falsifying documents and coercing my grandfather into signing papers? Sophia's words made Lawrence freeze. Lucas stood silently, unable to speak. The determination in Sophia's eyes made him feel uneasy, even afraid. Sophia didn't stop there. She quickly left the house and called Carmen, updating her on everything that had happened. Carmen immediately guided Sophia on how to contact another lawyer who could help protect Mr. Frank's rights. Sophia, you've done a great job, Carmen said over the phone. I'll come meet you tomorrow. We'll file a formal complaint and expose Lawrence. Sophia felt a wave of relief knowing she wasn't alone. But she also understood that Lucas wouldn't give up so easily. Inside the house, Lucas sat motionless in his chair, his mind racing. Sophia's words kept echoing in his head, making him feel like everything was falling apart. He turned to Lawrence, his voice urgent. What do we do now? Lawrence shrugged, but there was a trace of worry in his eyes. You need to shut this down before it goes any further. If Sophia takes this to court, we'll be in serious trouble. Lucas clenched his fists, a feeling of unease spreading through him. He knew he had gone too far, but his greed still pushed him forward. The next morning, Sophia and Carmen met with a new lawyer, Mr. Roberto. After listening to Sophia's account, Roberto quickly grasped the seriousness of the situation. "We have enough grounds to file a case against Lawrence and stop Lucas from carrying out his plan," Roberto said firmly. "But we need to act quickly before they do anything else." Sophia nodded, her heart filled with hope. She knew she had done the right thing. The evidence she had gathered would be the key to protecting her grandfather. That afternoon, Lucas returned home with Lawrence, determined to apply one last round of pressure. But this time, Mr. Frank was ready. "Lucas, how badly do you want that money?" Mr. Frank asked, his voice calm but deep. "You know exactly how much I want it," Lucas replied coldly. Mr. Frank nodded, then stood up. "Then let me be clear. I won't sign, and I won't let you harm this family any further. If you want a fight, I'm ready." Lawrence started to speak, but Sophia walked in, holding up her phone. "Mr. Lawrence, I think you should leave before the police arrive. I've already sent the recordings to our lawyer, Roberto." Lucas turned to Sophia, his eyes blazing with anger. "What are you doing, Sophia?" "I'm protecting our family," Sophia replied firmly. "I won't let you destroy everything because of your greed." Lawrence said nothing more. He quickly left the house, knowing there was no way out of this mess. Lucas stood frozen, realizing that everything was spiraling out of his control. That night, Mr. Frank sat under the old olive tree with Sophia. The moonlight bathed the garden in a serene glow. "Thank you, Sophia," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "If it weren't for you, I don't know where this would have ended." "I just did the right thing, Grandpa," Sophia replied, her eyes shining with determination. "We have to protect each other, don't we?" Mr. Frank nodded gently, though he knew deep down that the storm wasn't over yet. Lucas had changed, and the rift in their family wouldn't be easy to mend. Sophia sat beside Mr. Frank, her eyes filled with hope. The fight to protect her grandfather wasn't over, but she knew things were starting to turn in the right direction. With Roberto's help, Sophia felt reassured. "Grandpa," Roberto said, "the law is on our side," Sophia said softly, her tone encouraging. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Mr. Frank looked at his granddaughter, gratitude shining in his tired eyes. "Sophia, I just fear our family won't be the same again. Your father. I don't know if he'll ever realize his mistakes." Sophia squeezed his hand. "I believe Dad will change. But first, we need to stop Mr. Lawrence and keep him from doing anything else." The next day, Roberto came to Mr. Frank's house to discuss their next steps. Sophia and Mr. Frank sat at the table, listening intently to the experienced lawyer. "We've filed a formal objection with the court," Roberto began, his sharp eyes scanning the documents. "They will review the evidence Sophia has gathered. The recordings and Lawrence's actions are enough to prove he was coercing and falsifying documents." "What about my father?" Sophia asked anxiously. "Will he face legal consequences?" Roberto shook his head gently. "Lucas won't be charged unless he was directly involved in falsifying documents. However, his role in this scheme will be scrutinized by the court. I believe Lucas will face more moral consequences than legal ones." Mr. Frank lowered his head, his heart heavy. "I don't want Lucas to get hurt, but he needs to understand his mistakes." Roberto offered an encouraging smile. "I believe time will help him see the truth. For now, we just need to ensure the court makes the right decision." Elsewhere in the village, Lucas sat in his small house, overwhelmed by disappointment and confusion. He knew Lawrence had abandoned him after realizing the situation was unsalvageable. Lawrence wasn't even answering his calls anymore. Lucas gripped his phone, his hands trembling with anger. A sudden knock at the door startled Lucas. When he opened it, he saw Anna, the family's kind neighbor. "Lucas, may I come in?" Anna asked gently. Lucas sighed and stepped aside to let her in. What are you doing here, Anna? I came to talk to you, Anna said, sitting down with a serious expression. What do you think you're doing, Lucas? I've heard people in the village talking about this. Lucas turned away, his voice low. I don't need anyone telling me what to do. Anna remained undeterred and continued, Lucas, do you realize you're hurting your own family? Your father, Sophia, everyone is trying to protect you, but you've chosen a path that's breaking their hearts. Lucas stayed silent. Anna's words hit him like a blow to his pride, but he couldn't deny the truth. You're not a child anymore, Lucas. You need to take responsibility for your actions, Anna added, her tone softening. Come back to your family before it's too late. That afternoon, Sophia and Roberto attended a court hearing. Lucas was also present, but his face betrayed his unease. For the first time, he felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea how to climb back. The judge listened carefully to the evidence Sophia and Roberto presented. The recording of Lucas and Lawrence's conversation was played in the courtroom, leaving Lucas unable to lift his head. He could feel the disappointed gazes of everyone in the room, especially Mr. Frank and Sophia. After deliberating for a while, the judge made a ruling. Based on the evidence, the court declares that control of the assets will remain with Mr. Frank. Furthermore, Lawrence will be investigated for document falsification. The courtroom erupted with relief and joy. Sophia held her grandfather's hand, her face lit up with a radiant smile. Roberto gently patted Mr. Frank on the shoulder, speaking softly, It's over now. You can rest easy. Lucas sat motionless, the weight of defeat pressing heavily on his shoulders. But within him, a small glimmer of light flickered, an inkling of regret. When everyone returned home, Lucas was waiting at the door, his expression conflicted. Sophia walked up to him, ready to confront her father. Do you have something to say, Dad? Sophia asked, her tone cold. Lucas lowered his head, his voice rough and subdued. I'm sorry. I didn't realize how far I had gone. Sophia was silent for a moment before responding, You don't need to apologize to me. You need to apologize to Grandpa. Lucas turned toward Mr. Frank, his face filled with remorse. Dad. I was wrong. I don't know how to make things right. Mr. Frank stepped forward, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. Lucas, all I need is for you to understand your mistake. Family is more important than money. If you've learned that, I am content. Lucas felt a small sense of relief, but he knew that the harm he had caused couldn't be undone with just an apology. He lowered his head, silently promising himself that he would do whatever it took to make amends. That night, under the soft glow of the moon, Mr. Frank, Sophia, and Lucas sat together beneath the old olive tree. Mr. Frank shared the story of the lottery ticket and why he had kept it a secret. I didn't hide the money to make you suffer, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I was afraid money would tear the family apart. But now I see that my silence has caused its own pain. Sophia held her grandfather's hand, her voice filled with reassurance. Grandpa, you did the right thing. We'll get through everything as long as we have each other. Lucas looked at Sophia and Mr. Frank, his feelings of regret mixed with a newfound sense of hope. Perhaps this was a chance for him to start over, to right his wrongs. The next morning, gentle sunlight streamed through the lush olive trees. Sophia woke early and prepared breakfast for Mr. Frank and Lucas. For the first time in weeks, their small home felt peaceful again. When Sophia brought a cup of coffee to the table, Lucas sat quietly, staring into the distance. The soft golden light highlighted the fatigue on his face, but Sophia could sense a change in his expression, no longer angry or greedy, but thoughtful. Here's your coffee, Dad, Sophia said gently. Lucas looked up and nodded slightly. Thank you. Mr. Frank entered, leaning on his familiar wooden cane. He paused briefly when he saw Lucas sitting there but then decided to join them. Father and son exchanged a silent glance, and Sophia sensed an unspoken understanding between them. Dad, Grandpa, I have an idea, Sophia said, breaking the silence. I think we should use part of the money to do something good for the village. Mr. Frank turned to his granddaughter, his eyes filled with curiosity. What do you mean, Sophia? I think the money shouldn't just be for our family, Sophia explained, her voice full of enthusiasm. I want to fix up the old school and give the kids in the village a better place to learn. Lucas lifted his head, his eyes showing a hint of surprise. Sophia, do you really want to do that? Yes, Dad, Sophia replied. I've been thinking about it for a long time. The old school is in bad shape, and the kids don't even have enough books. If we can help, I'm sure Grandpa would feel proud. Mr. Frank smiled warmly, his eyes glowing with pride. Sophia, you're a wonderful young woman. I'm so proud of you. Lucas remained silent, looking from Sophia to Mr. Frank. He could feel the trust and faith they had in each other, and it made him reflect deeply. That afternoon, the three of them took a walk around the village. The neighbors greeted Mr. Frank with their usual respect. But when they saw Lucas, they only nodded coldly. Lucas knew he had lost their respect, and the realization weighed heavily on him. Lucas, do you see? Mr. Frank said, his voice gentle but profound. Respect from others doesn't come from money. It comes from how you live and how you treat people. Lucas didn't respond, but deep down, he knew his father was right. He slowed his pace, taking in the village he had lived in his whole life. The people here lived simply not wealthy, but warm and content. He realized that in his pursuit of ambition and material wealth, he had lost sight of life's true values. A few days later, Sophia and Mr. Frank began planning the renovation of the school. Roberto, their lawyer, volunteered to help with the planning and handling the legal paperwork. We'll need a construction crew to fix the roof, Roberto said as he sat with them in the living room. We'll also need to contact organizations to donate books and school supplies. Lucas sat quietly in the corner of the room, listening but not saying a word. He felt he no longer had the right to speak after everything he had done. But Sophia, as if reading her father's thoughts, turned to him and smiled. Dad, can you help us find a construction crew? You know a lot of people in the village. Lucas looked up, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. You really want me to help? Of course, Dad, Sophia replied. I know you can do a great job with this. I believe in you. Lucas felt a warm emotion sweep through him. For the first time in days, he felt like he could do something to make up for his mistakes. I'll do it, Lucas said, his voice trembling slightly. I'll help you and Grandpa. A week later, the renovation of the school began. Lucas led a group of workers to assess the roof and the classrooms. He worked tirelessly, coordinating with the crew to ensure everything went smoothly. Sophia and Mr. Frank were also hard at work. Sophia organized a small fundraising event in the village to encourage people to contribute. Many villagers brought books, old desks, and school supplies they no longer used. Carmen, Sophia's best friend, came to help as well. She assisted Sophia in reaching out to charitable organizations for additional support. Sophia, you're truly an inspiration for the whole village, Carmen said with a smile. Not at all, Sophia replied, her eyes shining. I just want to do the right thing. It's all thanks to Grandpa teaching me that happiness doesn't come from keeping money for yourself. One afternoon, as the work was underway, Lucas paused and looked around the school. He saw the villagers working together, their laughter filling the air with a sense of peace. Sophia and Mr. Frank stood in the corner of the yard, watching the children play with excitement. A strange feeling of tranquility washed over Lucas. Lucas walked over to Sophia and Mr. Frank. Bowing his head slightly, he said softly, "Thank you both for giving me this chance. I don't know if I deserve it, but I'll do my best." Mr. Frank smiled and placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. Lucas, family is a place that always gives you a chance. You've realized your mistakes, and that's more important than anything. Sophia smiled at her father. Dad, you do deserve it. Let's do this together for our family, and for the village. Lucas nodded, his heart warmed by the forgiveness and love he thought he had lost forever. The story of Lucas and Mr. Frank's family reminds us that money is not the source of happiness. Ambition and greed can lead people to lose themselves and the most important values in life, love and family bonds. Through the forgiveness and support of Sophia and Mr. Frank, Lucas came to understand that hard work, sincerity, and contributing to the community bring true peace and purpose. Family is always a sanctuary, helping us overcome mistakes and start anew.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.